Grade 7s, welcome to lesson 2.5, exploring deeper into the continent. Today we will focus on what did the early French explorers in New France achieve. So stick around and let's learn something. Achievement. What did the early French explorers in New France actually achieve? Welcome to lesson 2.5, and this is what we're going to answer today. So this section is called Exploring Deeper into the Continent. And I've got a picture here of these poor individuals. Look how difficult that has got to be. That is not going to be easy. It's not easy with today's advancements in clothing, technology, and knowledge. It especially wasn't easy back then. These guys look like they are just miserable. The first people to leave France, if you don't count the actual explorers that went on these expeditions, were people called Cordobois, the runners of the woods. And they left France because the European mentality on land ownership, land use, and things like that is going to be a lot different than that of the First Nations perspective on land. We learned the First Nations perspective of land back in chapter 1. We often talk about the European perspective on land and land use and ownership and that kind of stuff. Are there going to be some issues here? Yeah, you better believe that there's going to be some issues. And these are going to be big, huge, major issues. But we're going to start with the Cordobois. We're going to come back to land a little bit later. The Cordobois, these are the runners of the woods. And these were French men who came over to the New World. And you can't see me right now, but I'm using air quotations. They came over to the New World. And they got immersed into the language and the culture and the customs of the First Nations. They lived among the First Nations. And they were central in the fur trade. Now, remember, everybody's coming over for the fur trade because this is the fashion that was being driven in Europe. So they came over, they immersed themselves within the First Nations. So they got married. They had kids who become the first Métis, which we talk about later in this year. They were knowledgeable and fluent in the languages of the First Nations. They learned so many skills from First Nations, like building birch bark canoes, how to survive the wilderness, how to navigate and do all those kinds of things. And they came because, well, who doesn't like the idea of adventure? They came because France life was difficult. So you might as well have a difficult life here where there's at least some adventure and you've got all this freedom. You don't have this king and these taxes that are weighing heavily on you. And they came because of money. They were paid big dollars, top dollar, to be involved in the job that they were, to learn these languages, to learn navigation, and to help in the whole fur trade economy. So they were trapping furs. They acted as guides for other Europeans that would come over. Because they lived among the First Nations, they knew the language, so they could be interpreters. And they explored a huge chunk of the continent. And if it wasn't for them, the advancements that the Europeans make would not have happened because they wouldn't have had the knowledge, right? And these Cordobois, they were the in-between between the First Nations and that of the Europeans. And that whole idea of land and the perspective on land, these guys will definitely help out later on. The French are coming over. They're learning the culture of the First Nations. Then that means probably their way of life, their original history and stuff like that is going to be of interest to the First Nations. And that's exactly what some of the First Nations did. We learned about the Wendat in the last lesson. And there was this one French individual, Etienne Brûlé. He's one of our original Cordobois. And he went and he stayed with the Wendat for a long time. And the Wendat and I spelled it here wrong, my apologies. The Wendat sent one of their men over, Savignon, and he went to France. And this was our kind of first cultural exchange. Etienne Brûlé, he stays. Savignon, he goes to France. Etienne Brûlé, he learns the way of the Wendat. Again, it's those customs, those traditions, the hunting, the language, and he knows the territory. And he becomes the first European to travel up the Ottawa River. This is a big deal. Okay, for the 1600s, this is a huge deal. We're mapping out big chunks of the continent that will later become super important in the development of Canada. So the Wendat send a man over, Savignon, and what does Savignon do on his cultural exchange? Well, obviously, he is going to learn French customs. He is going to learn the French language. But if we know anything from our First Nations in Chapter 1, there is a specific way of life that they are going to be longing for. So Savignon, he comes back. And when he comes back and he's kind of like a hero. Hey, welcome back. Everybody is so happy to see him, and they want to hear his stories. Remember, nothing's written down. Everything in First Nation culture is oral history through storytelling. And he comes back, and everybody wants to hear about his experiences in France. And he tells them, he says, France is a horrible place to be. There's beggars in the streets. They are mean to children. They don't treat them like the First Nations will treat children. They're horrible to them. And there's constant fighting in the streets. So he does not paint a very nice picture of Europe to the First Nations that are living here in North America. And this picture, this is not the first time that we've seen this. So when Cartier brought the Haudenosaunee over and the one that returned, the First Nations, they don't have a good impression of Europe. It's a different way of life. They don't like it. So this cultural exchange, even though many Europeans are coming over to the New World, again, in air quotations, even though many are coming back to the New World, there's not many First Nations that are going to venture out to Europe because of all of these stories they hear about Europe. Etienne Brûlé, Savignon, first cultural exchange. Etienne Brûlé, super important Cordobois. Okay, so he went up the Ottawa River. But there's some more important people that we're going to learn about. Pierre Radisson and Sieur de Grossier. You like my French accent? These two individuals, they were the most, I got a spelling mistake here again. They were the most adventurous coureurs de bois that were around. And they found a lot of the ins and outs of the continent, lots of river routes. They made their way to the Great Lakes, which we'll talk about in a second. But we're going to start with Pierre Radisson. He was adopted by the Mohawks, and he lived with them for 2 years. Now, again, just like Etienne Brûlé, Pierre Radisson, he learns the customs, he learns the culture, he learns to speak the language, and he learns vital survival skills. And in 1659, Radisson joins de Grossier on a trading trip way out to the west of where they are. Okay, so east for us, but west for them. And they make it to the far end of Lake Superior. And I've got it highlighted there. It's in the red box on the top picture. They went a long way. And that's where they ended up. And the knowledge that they gained on that adventure, on that expedition, on that trip, whatever you want to call it, was vital to the fur trade. Their knowledge of fur country just grew exponentially. And the contacts they made with the First Nations that are along these routes are going to play a very important role in the fur trade, which we are going to see in Chapter 4. And along the way, they did what all European explorers did and what all European settlers did. They renamed places. So they renamed existing First Nation settlements. They renamed lakes that already had names from the First Nations. They renamed mountains. They renamed rivers. Any kind of landform that they saw, they gave it a French name. So this part of Ontario does still have a lot of French names. And that comes from Pierre Radisson and Sieur de Grossier. as they were moving out west. But not only did they go west, you can see I have another map here on the bottom. They also went north. They went north to the Hudson's Bay. Have you ever heard of Hudson's Bay before? They went in 1670. They went to Hudson's Bay. And eventually, and the reason that they go there is because they hear of an abundance of fur. And remember, fashion is driving this economy in this point in time, especially in the 1670s, in the mid-1600s. So they head over to Hudson's Bay, and they see, and they find a lot of fur. This is amazing. And then eventually, this Hudson's Bay, they go on to create the Hudson's Bay Company. Now, I know you've heard this before. It was the department store that we have here. So they helped the founding of that. We're not expanding east because east is Europe. So now we've got expansion west. We got all the way to the far end of Lake Superior. We've got expanding north right now. This is the Hudson's Bay area. And then we have still to expand south. And to expand south, this is all caused by rumors of this mighty, big, giant river. The Cree called it the Mississippi, the big river. And they're hearing this rumor of this big river. And in 1672, the King of France sends Joyer and Jacques Marquette to explore this river. Where does this river go? Where is it going to take them? It is going to take them far down south, almost to the Gulf of Mexico. They spend a few weeks. They're on this river, and they learn eventually that there's a Spanish colony that's further down the river. And they get scared because they think they're French. And at this time in history, the Europeans are not getting along with each other. They're all in competition to expand their empires. So these two think that, hey, if we get caught, we are going to be held hostage by the Spanish, and this is not a good thing. So they head back up north. And then in 1682, Cavalier de la Salle, he makes his way all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. He sneaks past the Spanish colonies, and he names all of this land in the name of the French king, Louisiana, and he claims it for the French king. If you look at this river, this is a huge river, the Mississippi. Some major cities are along this river. We have Minneapolis is on there, St. Louis is on there, Memphis is on there, New Orleans is on there. And then a lot of other major cities have their rivers flowing into the Mississippi, like Chicago, Indianapolis, Columbus, Cincinnati, Louisville, Nashville. These rivers are going into the Mississippi. Pittsburgh, Denver, all the way in the center of the continent, Oklahoma City. All of these rivers are going into the Mississippi. Now, this land was claimed for the King of France. Remember at the beginning of this lesson, there's different perspectives about land ownership. And you can see here, this is de Grossier's roots and Radisson's roots back in the mid-1600s. They claim all of this land in the name of France. People are already living here. Our First Nations are already here, and they have a completely different perspective on land. You can't own land. The land is there for everybody to share and to use. A European perspective, no, you own land. And this was the thing to do. Anytime a European made it someplace new that has never been discovered from a European perspective, they claimed it for their country. So in these examples today, in this lesson, they're claiming it for France. The French didn't understand how one cannot own land. How can't you own land? Well, the First Nations, they're like, well, how can you own land? How is it yours to own? And this perspective, these two different perspectives are going to cause major issues as we go on into our story about Canada. The First Nations, they shared the land with other groups. They came to agreements because of arguments that they would have, and they came to agreements on who can use the land for hunting and fishing, but there was no ownership there. There was territories and places you can use, but there was no ownership. And France, on the other hand, they're going out there claiming everything. They see it, yeah, that's French, that's French, that's French, that's French, that's French. It's all belonging to France. But there was a problem that France was claiming all this land, but who's there to protect it? So France is needing people now to come from France to the New World. Again, it's those air quotations. They need people to come to New France to live there to defend it. Otherwise, somebody else, another European, is going to come and take that land. Okay? Because again, we have the different perspectives on land ownership. But there's a problem with these lands that the French are claiming for themselves. It's in the wilderness and it's cold. And who is going to want to go and spend their life in the cold and in the wilderness? So although France is grabbing up all this land, it's actually very difficult for them to maintain and keep this land because nobody is willing to come over here to settle this land from a European perspective because it's in the wilderness and it's super cold. All right, I want you to head over to your notebook and complete the questions for this part of the chapter.